Late at night, a telephone rings when it shouldn't. The voice on the other end is faint or just crackling static. Moments later, you learn the impossible. The call came from someone who died hours or days before. These are no horror movie plots, but real accounts of paranormal phone calls. History is filled with eerie tales of the dead seemingly reaching out through the telephone lines. For over a century, the telephone has been a lifeline connecting loved ones across distances. But in some chilling cases, this line between hearts stretches across the boundary of life and death. Phantom phone calls, where the dearly departed appear to call the living, have been reported more often than you might think. Such calls defy logic, leaving families spooked yet oddly comforted. Researchers who have studied this phenomenon note common patterns. These mysterious calls often come soon after a person's death, sometimes within hours, though a few have occurred months or even years later. The calls typically crackle with heavy static, and the caller's voice, if heard at all, sounds distant or faint. It's as if the voice is coming from far away indeed. One famous experiencer of a call from beyond was best-selling horror author Dean Koontz. If anyone was prepared for a ghostly encounter, you'd think it might be a writer of dark thrillers. Yet nothing could prepare Koontz for the phone call he received one September day in 1988. Sitting in his office, Koontz's telephone rang unexpectedly. On the line was a woman's voice that would haunt him thereafter. Koontz answered the phone and heard a female's voice, eerily unfamiliar, yet somehow known to him. The connection was crackling and distant. With great urgency, the woman on the line delivered a simple, repeated message. "Please be careful." Koontz was startled. He asked who it was, but the caller didn't identify herself. She just repeated the warning, growing fainter each time. After 3 or 4 pleas to be careful, the voice fell silent. The call had ended as mysteriously as it began. Shaken, Koontz realised the voice sounded like his mother, but that was impossible. Koontz's mother had been dead nearly 20 years. His number was unlisted, so it was unlikely to be a prank targeted at him. He confided in his wife about the strange call, unsure what to believe. 2 days later, the meaning of the phantom warning became shockingly clear. Koontz went to visit his elderly father at a care home and walked straight into danger. When Koontz arrived, his father, who suffered from mental confusion, suddenly lunged at him with a hidden knife. Staff called the police, who burst in to find Koontz holding the knife he'd wrestled away. For a tense moment, officers mistook Koontz for the attacker and trained their guns on him. In that instant, Koontz remembered the mysterious phone call's warning. He stayed calm and compiled, avoiding a tragic misidentification. Later, Koontz acknowledged that the bizarre call may have saved his life. He never received another call like it, but the experience left him wondering if, just maybe, his mother had found a way to reach him one last time. Dean Koontz's story may sound extraordinary, but he is far from alone. Ordinary people around the world have reported similar, unexplainable calls. Paranormal researchers have collected an endless well of anecdotal cases of phone calls from the dead. Often these calls come as a final message or farewell. Sometimes the callers speak a few words, other times the line is filled with static, as though the connection itself is spectral. Every tale leaves the living witness with goosebumps and profound questions. Consider one case from a social services worker. She had just approved an emergency payment of £100 to help an older client with her bills. Before she could close the case, her office phone rang. It was the client on the line, sounding oddly distant. "I won't be needing the £100 after all," the woman said. The call ended abruptly. Later that day, the stunned worker read the newspaper obituaries and discovered that very client had died the day before, who then had phoned to cancel the cheque. In another instance, a man kept seeing a familiar name appear on his caller ID. It was his grandfather, who had passed away some time before. The first time, the family assumed someone was calling from Grandpa's old phone. Yet no one was there. On a second occasion, the man was at work when the phone rang. He picked it up on the first ring, only to hear nothing but a dial tone. Checking the call log, he was chilled to find the caller was again listed as his late grandfather. No explanation ever emerged for these impossible calls, but they gave the family an uncanny sense that Grandpa was somehow still around. True tales like these set the stage for one of the most chilling events in recent memory involving phantom calls, the case of Charles Peck and the 2008 Chatsworth train disaster. On the 12th of September 2008, a Metrolink commuter train, packed with evening rush hour passengers, sped through California's San Fernando Valley. It failed to stop at a red signal and collided head-on with a freight train at high speed. The result was carnage. Of 225 people on board, 25 lost their lives and over 100 were injured in what became one of California's worst train disasters. Among those killed instantly was 49-year-old Charles E. Peck, a passenger travelling that day to meet his fiancée. Charles Peck's fiancée, Andrea Katz, was driving to the station to pick him up when she heard news of the crash on the radio. Heart pounding, she rushed towards the accident site. Then her cell phone rang, displaying Charles's number. A surge of hope filled her. Perhaps Charles was alive, trapped in the wreckage and reaching out. Andrea answered eagerly, but there was no voice, only crackling static on the line. The call then cut off. Over the next frantic hours, as rescue teams worked through the twisted metal and debris, Charles's phone kept calling his loved ones again and again. His fiancée, his brother, his stepmother, his son. In total, 35 calls were placed from Charles's mobile phone that night. Family members, who saw his name light up, felt a jolt of optimism. Charles must be alive, trying to contact us, but whenever someone answered, all they heard was static or silence, no voice. The calls continued until 3:28 a.m., nearly 11 hours after the crash. Rescue workers, alerted by these persistent calls, used them to help pinpoint Charles's location amid the wreckage. At around 4 a.m., they finally recovered his body. Heartbreakingly, Charles had died on impact in the initial collision. He never made it out of his seat alive. The calls, it turned out, did not mean he was safe. They were a mystery. Investigators later confirmed Charles could not have physically been making phone calls. In fact, they never even found Charles's phone itself. It was lost or destroyed in the crash. Yet somehow, that phone had reached out to his family members dozens of times, as if trying to guide rescuers to his body. The story of Charles Peck's phantom calls left both his family and public baffled. Technically, some argue, it could have been a bizarre glitch. Perhaps damage to the phone caused it to dial out numbers from its contact list at random. But if so, it's awfully strange that it dialed primarily those closest to him and no one else. To Charles's loved ones, the simplest and most poignant explanation is the one they hold in their hearts, that Charles's spirit was reaching out in those final hours, refusing to leave this world without reassuring his family one last time. Andrea later said she even shouted into the phone when his calls came, encouraging him, "Hang in there, we're going to get you out," hoping against hope that somehow he could hear her through the ether. A few months earlier, in 2008, Another family experienced a similar haunting phenomenon on the other side of the world. In this case, it wasn't during the disaster, but after a natural death, yet it was just as inexplicable. Shortly after a woman named Lorraine Evans died of an illness, her daughter Sarah began receiving phone calls from Lorraine's number. The first came about 2 weeks after the funeral. Sarah was at home when her phone rang, and to her shock the caller ID displayed her mum's name. Fighting a wave of disbelief, she answered. There was only silence, then a faint whisper that she couldn't quite make out. The line went dead. Lorraine's phone account had been terminated the day after her death. No one should have been calling from it, yet the call log clearly showed her mother's disconnected number. Over the next month, 12 more calls came through to Lorraine's family from that same number. Each time, if they picked up, they heard static or nothing at all. When Sarah Evans pressed the phone company for answers, they were equally flummoxed. Records show that a total of 13 outgoing calls had indeed been made from Lorraine's cancel line. Even more bizarre, each call lasted exactly 13 seconds before hanging up. It was as though some unseen force was playing with the phone line just long enough to register a connection. Technically, it should have been impossible for a disabled phone line to make calls at all. News of Lorraine's calls from beyond spread, and both paranormal investigators and telecom technicians examined the case. They proposed various theories, but none fit comfortably. Perhaps an error in the system caused old calls or caller ID data to be replayed, but the phone company found no evidence of any malfunction. A hoax? Skeptics wondered if a family member kept the phone and made the calls as a prank or for attention. However, multiple witnesses experienced the calls firsthand, and phone company logs confirmed their timing. There was no sign of human trickery, only the mystery calls. Finally, some suggested it was truly a message from beyond. To believers, the pattern itself was meaningful. 13 calls of 13 seconds each. The number 13, though often seen as unlucky, is considered spiritually significant by some, a symbol of transition or transformation. Could it be that Lorraine, a devoted mother, was sending a coded reassurance to her family that she had safely transformed to the other side? Mediums who had heard of this case felt like the timing and consistency were too precise to be a coincidence. In their view, Lorraine's love found a way to bridge the gap between worlds, using the phone as her instrument. Lorraine's story, like Charles Peck, remains unsolved. Both cases captured public fascination, and they're not unique. Throughout history, people have told similar tales of mysterious communications coinciding with death. Often these calls serve as farewells or reassurance from the departed. In the wake of these events, families are left wondering if a final goodbye might truly echo over the telephone wires. At the very least, such accounts challenge our understanding of life, death, and the limits of technology. Even major historical tragedies have given rise to whispers of phantom phone calls. After the 11th of September 2001 terrorist attacks, some relatives of World Trade Center victims reported receiving calls in the days after the disaster from their loved ones' cell numbers. Calls that, by any normal explanation, should have been impossible. In each story, the family answered full of hope, only to find no one there. Skeptics note that such claims are difficult to verify and may stem from glitches or wishful thinking, but to the families who experienced them, these eerie calls felt very real. They took it as a sign that, even amid an immense tragedy, love refused to be silenced by death. The phenomenon of phone calls from the dead isn't a new urban legend born in the internet age. It actually dates back decades. In fact, in 1979, two researchers, D. Scott Rogo and Raymond Bayless, published a book documenting a 2-year investigation into cases of phantom phone calls. They categorised calls that came at the moment of a person's death or shortly after, as well as calls where the deceased seemingly spoke to the living from beyond the grave. There are even reports going as far back as the 1960s of people receiving unexplained telephone calls from departed friends. The idea of communicating with spirits through technology has intrigued and frightened people for generations. Across all these accounts, certain haunting similarities persist. Many who pick up these calls describe an immediate sense of uncanny dread or electricity in the air. The voice, if any, might be distorted or recognisable only by a word or two. Frequently, the call is so brief that no meaningful conversation occurs. It might disconnect after a few seconds, leaving only a buzzing dial tone. A lot of witnesses recall static filling the line, with the phantom voice very faint and far away. It's as if the callers struggle to push their message through a heavy veil between worlds. And notably, a large number of these mysterious calls occur within a day of the person's death, when emotions are at their peak. It's often a final goodbye, coming not through a dream or a vision, but through a ringing telephone. So what could be behind these ghostly calls? Skeptics lean towards natural explanations. Telephone technology isn't infallible. There are anecdotes of voicemails that play back at odd times, of caller ID errors, and of phones that dial the last number called due to hardware defects. In cases like Charles Peck's, some suggest the extreme damage to his phone could have caused an electrical short that dialed out numbers randomly. That doesn't explain why it dialed multiple family members specifically, nor why his phone was never found to analyse. Other mundane possibilities include crossed wires or calls that were made by the living but misattributed to the deceased due to network timing errors, and of course a hoaxer with access to the deceased's phone or phone number could mimic a ghost call, though in most documented cases there's no evidence that this happened. On the other end of the spectrum, paranormal researchers theorise that these calls might indeed be what they seem. Attempts by spirits to communicate using electrical devices. They point to the field of electronic voice phenomena, EVP, where researchers and ghost hunters have long claimed that the dead can imprint voices on recording devices or radio frequencies. Some scientists have speculated that intense emotional energy at the moment of death could imprint itself onto electronics, creating a sort of residual signal that plays back as a phone call. In this view, a telephone might be easier for a spirit to manipulate than a full-bodied apparition. After all, a phone call already carries voices across invisible waves. Why couldn't a lingering spirit hijack those signals briefly? It's a fanciful idea, but one that comforts those looking for meaning in these events. For the families on the receiving end, a phone call can be a profoundly emotional experience. In the initial shock, many feel fear, a cold chill knowing the caller is someone who shouldn't be there. But just as often, there's a sense of comfort or closure. Recall Andrea Katz, who truly believed her fiancé Charles was contacting her during those awful hours after the crash. She spoke to him through the static, offering love and encouragement. Others have said that a brief hello or a familiar nickname uttered from beyond was enough to assure them that their loved one was at peace. The content of these calls, when there is content, is almost always simple and positive, like a final "I'm okay" or "I love you," delivered across cosmic distances. Even in cases where nothing is heard, just seeing the deceased's name flash on the screen can bring a bittersweet comfort, as if they're saying, "I haven't really left you." Despite numerous reports, no phantom call has ever been definitively proven to be a message from the afterlife. But neither have they been debunked. They remain unsettling question marks. Phone companies typically cannot trace these incidents in detail. In Charles Peck's case, officials acknowledged the calls happened, but had no explanation once the device itself wasn't recovered. In Lorraine Evans' case, technicians confirmed her line was inactive and should not have been making calls. The mystery remains unsolved. In the end, whether you accept these stories as truth or see them as coincidences and errors might depend on your personal beliefs. For those who have lived through it, though, the experience is utterly real and life-changing. They are left with the tantalizing possibility that, in certain moments of great love or trauma, the barrier between life and death might not be as absolute as we assume. Why do these stories captivate us? Perhaps it's because they offer a glimmer of hope in the face of loss. The notion that death is not truly the final goodbye. A telephone is such a mundane, modern object. Yet in these tales, it becomes a channel for something sacred, a last connection. The idea that a husband, wife, parent, or friend might fight through the static of the beyond just to hear our voice again, or to tell us one last time that we matter to them. It sends shivers down the spine, but it's also strangely comforting. It suggests love can transcend even the great divide between this life and the next. So the next time your phone rings from an unknown number late at night, you might just hesitate. Could that unexpected call be someone long departed reaching out? Most of us will laugh off the thought and attribute a dropped call or static on the line to technical issues. Yet the stories you've heard tonight still linger. They remind us that our modern, wired world still has its mysteries, and they leave us with a question that is equal parts eerie and enticing. If the dead did have something to say, would we be ready and willing to take that call? Phone calls from the afterlife remain one of the most intriguing corners of paranormal lore. Skeptics and scientists will continue to seek rational answers, while believers find meaning in those brief, static-laced moments of contact. In the end, whether these calls are truly haunted phone lines or not, they serve as powerful reminders of the bounds of love and longing. Every story of a ghostly call is, at its heart, a story of human connection that refuses to die. And perhaps that enduring connection, that refusal to let go, is a real message from beyond, one that transcends any telephone signal.